Hello, my name is Nick Bright, scholar of East Asian religions.
And I'm Proven Paradox, a guy with a lot of questions.
And you're listening to Bright on Buddhism, a podcast where we discuss East Asian Buddhism, answering listener-submitted questions from listeners just like you, and introducing concepts of Buddhism that you may or may not be familiar with in a casual, conversational setting. Enjoy.
Here, I was discussing the Dharma with a colleague recently. We came to a disagreement that could have been resolved by referring to a specific line from a specific sutra, but there are so many of them, many of which discuss similar topics. We were unable to locate the quotation we needed. The exercise left me with some questions, not regarding the teachings themselves, but the logistics of discussing them. How is the body of the Buddha's work organized? Going forth from that, how do we find specific sermons when we are reading about them? People often write about or discuss the sermons, and it would be nice to know how to find the specific work they're discussing.
Indeed, these are good questions. How interesting that the Buddha has said what he has said, but then his disciples have had to figure out how to file and organize what he said for future use after the fact. It simply isn't possible to organize so many sermons chronologically, or by topic, or by importance or significance. So, most commonly, they're actually organized by length and by type of text. Others, however, try to group them together by genre. Ultimately, any method of organization requires imposing a system onto the sermons that wasn't given by the Buddha himself.
Fascinating. Organizing by length makes some sense, given that there is such variety, from hundreds of pages to a single letter. However, I can also see an argument for genre as well. That makes it easier for a researcher to find different treatments of similar topics.
Indeed.
Hello, and welcome to this week's episode of Bright on Buddhism. This week, we will be discussing sutra citations. How do you cite sutras and read those citations? Why does this matter? We hope you enjoy, so let's get into it. How do you cite sutras?
This is a good and important question because there are different methods that float around, but there are some common requirements, as we will see. Citing sutras requires a lot of nuance because sutras don't work the same way as other holy texts, like the Bible, the Torah, the Talmud, or the Quran. To begin with where and why we would cite sutras, we would cite them if we are quoting or summarizing what they say in an academic context, or a context when somebody may want to go back to the original material you're quoting or summarizing to read some more about it. For citing sutras, there is a decision tree that you have to follow. First, is the sutra in the Pali canon or not? That will determine a certain amount of accompanying information. If the sutra was in the Pali canon, you'd include supplemental info such as which of the Nikayas or collections of sutras the text comes from. Texts from the Taisho or Mahayana canon are sorted a little bit differently, as I will explain in a moment. The next question you need to ask is, was this text translated into whatever language you're reading it in, or are you reading it in Pali? If it was translated, your citation should acknowledge that you did not translate the text yourself. It doesn't matter when the translation was done, even if you're reading ancient Chinese translations of the sutras, such as those produced by Kumarajiva or Xuanzang, both of whom we have episodes on, links in the show notes, you will still need to credit them as translators. If it was not translated out of Pali, and you're reading it in Pali or Sanskrit, you probably don't need guidance on citations, because you're trained academically to read and understand Pali, which is a dead language, or Sanskrit, which is a dead language and solely a textual language. You also don't need to write down who you think put the sutra to paper in one of the first 3 Buddhist councils, which we've discussed and mentioned in a number of episodes. The reason is that the factual info about who actually wrote the sutra down is lost to history, most likely. The texts themselves claim that Ananda spoke the sutras, he remembered, and the monks wrote them down at these councils, but those monks are mostly nameless and could be entirely fictional. The authorship of sutras is a very complicated issue, just like it is with the authorship of the Bible and other holy texts, so you don't need to give authorial information in any of those contexts. The next question you will ask is how long is the sutra in total, and how long is the passage you're using? If the complete text is short, then you do not need to include page, chapter, or section information in the citation. If it's longer than a handful of pages, you will need to indicate what pages, chapters, or sections you're working with or quoting. If you pull one line out of a sutra, you can't just cite the whole thing because that's incomplete information. For context, the Avatamsaka Sutra, as an example, is 1,100 pages translated into English. If you just pull a sentence out of that without indicating where that sentence is written, nobody who checks up on you will be able to find that one line in a timely fashion. Citations are designed to make it clear and easy to see where the pieces of textual evidence you're using came from, so that people can follow in your footsteps to understand how you reached your conclusions or made your claims about what they say. If you don't show your work effectively, it can't be reproduced, and that lack of reproducibility invites doubt about the robustness of that work. You can make any argument about any text on earth if you make claims based on quotations that are taken out of context or are quoted incompletely. So robust citations give others the ability to verify that the passages you are quoting or summarizing are actually saying what you claim that they say. As an example, there is a line in the Lankavatara Sutra where the Buddha says to Mahamati, quote, "For innumerable reasons, Mahamati, the Bodhisattva, whose nature is compassion, is not to eat any meat." If I took a piece of that out of context, or I altered the sentence, I could say something like, quote, "For innumerable reasons, Mahamati, the Bodhisattva, whose nature is compassion, is not to eat," unquote. Looking at this, someone would think that being a good Buddhist means starving oneself. But that's not the case at all. If you go back and look at that original line, you'd see in no uncertain terms that the Buddha is not calling on bodhisattvas to starve themselves. He's calling on them to not eat meat, which is totally different.
Another example I've encountered, I have seen people quote portions of On the Origin of Species by Charles Darwin, attempting to imply that he had lingering doubts about his theory of evolution. However, in the book, he writes about counter-arguments he expects others to make to refute his claims. If one just quotes those counter-arguments, it seems like Darwin had serious doubts. In context, he is addressing doubts he expects other people to have, not his own. This is a case of people with an agenda acting in bad faith.
To look at a much less serious example, in the live-action Scooby-Doo 2 movie from 2004, a flustered Fred Jones gives an interview to a news station where he says something along the lines of, "You guys are trying to make it sound like I think Coolsville sucks." And then the news channel airs a cut of that interview where it's just Fred saying, "I think Coolsville sucks." The reason why is that the reporter, Heather Jasper Howe, was trying to shift public opinion against Mystery Incorporated. This is one of the most perfect and succinct examples of taking stuff out of context or quoting it selectively in bad faith. Heather Jasper Howe and the scholar who selectively quoted Darwin are both bad at their jobs because they didn't follow fastidious citation practices. It's important to mention that the character from the Scooby-Doo 2 movie is doing all of this for comedic effect and for the plot of the story, and the person who's misquoting Darwin or selectively quoting Darwin is doing so because they're anti-science. These are situations with two very different stakes, but the practice is still the exact same. They're selectively quoting and removing things from context in order to misrepresent the opinion of the individual that they're quoting.
How do you read sutra citations?
The order that information is presented in citations varies widely by the style and type you're looking at. However, most citation styles move from what they believe to be the general to the specific. So let's say you're reading a citation of the quote I read from the Lankavatara Sutra earlier. "For innumerable reasons, Mahamati, the Bodhisattva, whose nature is compassion, is not to eat any meat." You're quoting the sutra as a book since it was translated, so usually the first part is the translator's name. D.T. Suzuki is the translator in our example. D.T. Suzuki was a prolific translator and writer in both English and Japanese, so this is the most general information because we could be looking at any of the material that he wrote. Next, you should indicate that you're citing Suzuki as the translator, not as the original author. That tells you that D.T. Suzuki didn't author the text that you're citing, regardless of if we know who the author of the original text was. The next piece of information is the title of the text. In our example, this is the Lankavatara Sutra. The Lankavatara Sutra is 250-ish pages in English, so we have to specify where we're looking in that text to get this quote about not eating any meat. The quote I gave you comes from chapter 8, titled On Meat Eating. So we would see that chapter next after the title, likely with the title of the chapter included. That chapter itself is 12 pages long, so we need to say what page the line came from. In our example, based on the copy that we have, that quote comes from page 212. So, the whole citation should be D.T. Suzuki translator, the Lankavatara Sutra, Chapter 8 on Meat Eating, page 212. Some translations have multiple editions, and so if that was the case, then you would often want to add that information somewhere in the citation as well, either with the title of the work or at the very end. The Lankavatara Sutra, and the quote that we cited, is a good example of a Mahayana text that's in the Taisho canon, so let's look at an example of a Pali canon text. Most of the same information applies, except as part of the title of the text, you want to include information about what Nikaya that the text comes from. In our episode on the Pali Canon, link in the show notes, there are 5 Nikayas, or collections of the sutras. They are the Digha Nikaya, the Majjhima Nikaya, the Samyutta Nikaya, the Anguttara Nikaya, and the Kundaka Nikaya. Though there may be many versions or translations of a text, its place in a canon is set in a particular order. For example, the Samanapala Sutta, which we've read and discussed, will always be Sutra number 2 of the Digha Nikaya. So you will always want to indicate DN2 when you cite it, no matter what the translation or version is that you're reading. All texts in the Pali Canon, including the Vinaya Pitaka texts and the Abhidhamma Pitaka texts, have set orders like this, so your citation will need to reflect that. This same set order is actually also true of Taisho canon texts, but the citation rules are relaxed around those because you may be citing them as translated books rather than just as scriptures. For example, the Lankavatara Sutra we read and that D.T. Suzuki translated from is always Sutra number 672 of the Taisho canon. However, it's only common to include that information when you're reading the text in ancient Chinese, especially because we have no extant Pali version, though we suspect one to have existed and been lost to time.
Why do these citations matter?
I think that there are 3 aspects in which this matters. The first is solely academic, which we've already talked about a little bit. The second is structural for the Buddhist texts themselves. The third is comparative between Buddhism and other religions. In the academic context, citations are important for all the reasons we discussed. You want to make sure to show your work and to be transparent that you're not withholding, misrepresenting, and/or falsifying information. It covers your butt and also gives your readers the opportunity to retrace your steps and see if they get to the same destination you did. Academic work on religious texts is subjective and interpretive, so 2 people can read the same thing and come to 2 completely different conclusions about what it means, and they could each have really strong arguments for those conclusions. This is the beauty of academia. Nothing is ever one and done. It's all always in conversation, in flux, and subject to who's looking at it. In the structural context of the sutras, this is important because there are different canons. The canons have different organizational structures. The texts in the canons have different versions and structures within themselves, and they have different accompanying info as a result. There are 3 extant versions of the Lankavatara Sutra, for example, and they're numbered 670, 671, and 672. If we had the Pali originals, they'd be organized into scrolls. Many of the earliest extant Chinese versions are organized into scrolls as well. When translated, these scrolls are mushed together or they're reorganized into chapters or sections. As a result, the item you're citing will have a unique set of metadata accompanying it, and you'll need to provide all of that to direct readers to the same thing you're looking at. The final point regards intellectual history and comparative religion. The way one cites other holy texts, such as those from Abrahamic religions, is more set and standardized because the canons are more unified. As an example, in Christianity, the whole canon is just the Bible. You just need to specify the version, the book, the chapter, and the verse in the citation. Because Buddhism has the largest volume of holy text out of any major world religion, one must include more information with the item that's being cited. Looking at this issue historically, the development of canons, the development of the practice of citing things textually in a systematized fashion, and the standardization of academic research practices are all very recent. These things only really started to enter Western discourse in the 18th century, and they're still in flux to this day. However, there has been 2,000 years of textual tradition in Buddhism, and just about as much, if not more, in other religions. So, we have to impose these standards and practices back across a massive body of textual knowledge and a large amount of time. These standards and practices of canonization, academia, and citation originated in the West and favored Western values, materials, and goals. To then turn around and impose all of that onto Asian materials creates all sorts of issues because the texts and materials may not be suited to that system, or vice versa. Across the last 300 years, As academia surrounding non-Western materials has taken place, many non-Western people have also tried to come up with their own original and native academic systems. As an example, Japanese scholarship on Buddhism has, at times, tried to break with the common standards and practices of Western academia and apply their own. This means approaching the materials differently, both ideologically and practically, and writing about them and citing them differently in an attempt to, quote-unquote, take back academic scholarship about the materials. The imposition of Western academia onto non-Western people and materials was a direct effect of colonialism and imperialism, which was a very harmful system. In the healing process, many victims of colonization and imperialism have tried to reclaim agency, independence, identity, and equity in their own textual examinations of materials. This process is very positive because it decolonizes academia, a colonialist enterprise at its heart, and it encourages and results in different views, approaches, ways of thinking, and systems around materials themselves. There has even been the advent of things like ethnomathematics. We may believe that math is math and is undeniable or unable to be challenged, but math is a product of academic endeavor, and all academic endeavor is a cultural practice, and all cultural practices carry cultural baggage and bias. That means that whether we want to admit it or not, math carries cultural biases, depending on who is doing it. This makes some sense when we think about how different cultures have counted in base 12, base 2, or base 27 instead of base 10, or how many places have used Roman numerals versus using Arabic numerals. It also has implications with regards to more complicated operations and contexts, but I'm just not as familiar with those to describe them here. I'm far more familiar with the details of these fields in the context of Buddhism and religious studies. In principle, the idea of ethnomathematics still interests me and strikes me as positive and as being based on strong foundations. To turn to a Buddhist studies related example, some anti-colonial movements in Buddhist studies have been things like scholar-monk movements, applications of anti-imperialist theories onto Buddhist materials, nativist applications, and anti-Orientalist approaches. To be more specific, there have been and are many Buddhist monks from Asia who have responded to Western academic perspectives. They have written scholarly materials to correct some of the faulty claims that come about as a result of Westerners having an outsider-looking-in perspective, instead of being an insider, like the Buddhist monks are. In addition, there have been examinations of Buddhist text, doctrine, and history from a Marxist, anti-Orientalist, and nativist perspective. These can become very ethnocentric and problematic in their own ways, especially the nativist studies, but they seek to examine Buddhism from a place of taking ownership over it and its development as being a product of one's own culture and context. One fascinating academic project I have seen is from Japanese scholars, particularly 100 or so years ago, who sought to create their own Hankyo, or Panjiao, which is a hierarchy of different types of Buddhism. It was very common for monks and thinkers to tout the superiority of their own sect over others, but this was mainly a medieval phenomenon. Japanese scholars in the 19th or 20th centuries were the first to pick up the practice in a very long time. In their process, they were also imparting imperialist and ethnocentric biases onto Buddhist history, arguing that the Indian Buddhists had the poorest understanding of Buddhism, and then the Chinese had the next best, and then the Japanese had the very best, which demonstrated the Japanese people's right to rule over all of Asia. Problematic though this point of view is, it's an example of an approach to the study of Buddhism that rejects all of the biases of Western academic study and tries to take over ownership of the material. At the end of the day, human beings are biased, and cultures and societies introduce bias in the way that they examine the world and produce knowledge. This needs to be challenged and removed wherever possible. Every new group and culture and society introduces its own bias, but having access to a variety of views and understanding different biases paints a more complete picture of the human condition and of human knowledge.
We hope you enjoyed this episode on Sutra Citations. Join us next week where we will be discussing Tibetan Buddhism. What is Tibetan Buddhism? What are some important historical points about it? What do the various schools of Tibetan Buddhism believe? We hope to see you there. Thank you for listening.
Thank you for listening, and we'll see you next time. If you like our show and would like to support us financially, we ask instead that you send that generosity to a worthy cause. For now, we ask that you donate to a local food bank. We encourage international listeners to do this as well, but this especially goes out to our American listeners. The Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, SNAP for short, is currently suspended. SNAP benefits help feed people all across the U.S., particularly people with children or who are disabled, elderly, and/or people of color. This is going to leave many Americans unable to afford food. Right now, food banks are the best equipped to help people affected. Times are hard, and they're only going to get worse before they get better. If we're going to get through this, we have to take care of each other. If you can, we recommend that you donate cash instead of food. These groups buy their supplies at wholesale prices, which are much lower than retail prices that most consumers will pay. They can stretch a dollar a lot farther than most of us. We also suggest that you donate locally, which you can do by searching your zip code on feedingamerica.org's Find Your Local Food Bank section, linked in the show notes. Thank you. My name is Nick Bright, scholar of East Asian religions and the voice of Hearer.
And I'm Docs, editor, question asker, and voice of Hermit.
And this has been Bright on Buddhism. Thank you for listening. If you like our podcast, or if you have any questions that you'd like us to discuss, we'd love to hear from you. Please consider leaving a comment, review, or subscribing. You can also reach us by email at bright.on.buddhism@gmail.com. As always, citations and resources for this episode can be found in the show notes. Thank you.